Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The information provided in this video regarding matrimonial law, Islamic jurisprudence, and demographic statistics is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice from a licensed attorney or religious edicts from a qualified scholar. Laws regarding divorce, custody, and asset division vary significantly by state and jurisdiction within the United States, and the application of religious principles depends on individual circumstances and specific sectarian interpretations. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with licensed legal professionals and recognized religious authorities before making any personal or legal decisions. For decades, there was a prevailing myth whispered in the hallways of Islamic centers from New York to California that the Muslim family unit was an impenetrable fortress, immune to the societal pressures that lead to the dissolution of marriage in the West. But if you look closely at the data emerging from the last 5 years, a different story begins to unfold. Imagine a young couple in suburban Chicago. They are both second-generation Americans, highly educated, and active in their local community. To their peers, they represent the gold standard of the modern American Muslim family. Yet, behind closed doors, they are navigating a complex, high-stakes labyrinth that their immigrant parents never had to face. They are caught between two distinct legal systems, two different sets of cultural expectations, and a digital world that has fundamentally rewired how they view companionship. This is not just an isolated story. It is a demographic tidal wave that is reshaping the American Muslim landscape. Historical trends suggest that for much of the late 20th century, divorce rates within the U.S. Muslim community remained significantly lower than the national average, often cited in the single digits. However, contemporary case studies and sociological research, such as those conducted by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, indicate a massive shift. We are now seeing divorce rates that are rapidly converging with the broader American population, with some estimates suggesting that nearly 1/3 of all American Muslim marriages may end in dissolution. This is a staggering departure from the model minority narrative of the 1990s. The open loop we must address is this. Why is this happening now, and what does it mean for the future of the fastest-growing religious group in the United States? Is the community facing a crisis of faith, or is it experiencing a necessary evolution in the way it handles interpersonal justice? In this deep dive masterclass, we are going to solve a problem that many are too afraid to discuss in public. We are going to provide you with a comprehensive roadmap to understanding the structural, psychological, and legal shifts currently taking place. By the end of this series, you will understand the specific triggers that lead to divorce in this demographic, from the double divorce phenomenon where couples must navigate both civil and religious courts, to the impact of the gender education gap where Muslim women are outstripping men in higher education at unprecedented rates. We are moving beyond the surface-level tropes and looking at the raw data of how life in the United States has fundamentally altered the Islamic matrimonial contract. This isn't just about why marriages fail. It is about how the definition of a successful life is being rewritten by a generation that refuses to accept the status quo of their predecessors. To understand where we are going, we have to look at the historical foundation. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act brought a wave of highly skilled professionals from the Muslim world to the United States. These pioneers established the first major wave of mosques and community centers with a focus on preservation. In that era, the potential outcomes of a troubled marriage were often suppressed by a survivalist mindset. The primary goal was to assimilate into the American economy, while keeping the family unit intact at all costs. Because the community was small and insular, the social cost of divorce was astronomically high. A woman seeking a divorce in the 1970s or 80s often faced total social ostracization, leading many to remain in dysfunctional or even abusive situations to avoid the shame or aib associated with a broken home. Fast forward to the present day, and the demographic profile has shifted from an immigrant-dominant group to one that is majority native-born or second generation. This shift is the primary driver of the current statistics. For the second-generation American Muslim, the cultural stigma of divorce is losing its power. This generation views marriage through a lens of emotional fulfillment and mutual respect, rather than just a transaction for lineage or legal status. They are navigating what sociologists call the individualization of religion, where personal ethics and well-being are prioritized over communal optics. Consider the educational demographic shift. Recent data shows that American Muslim women are among the most highly educated female religious groups in the United States, second only to Jewish women. This creates a fascinating and complex dynamic in the marriage market. When a woman has the financial independence afforded by a career in medicine, law, or tech, her tolerance for a marriage that does not meet her emotional or intellectual needs decreases. We are seeing a rise in khula, a process where the wife initiates the divorce, which was historically less common in immigrant settings. This shift is a direct result of increased legal literacy and economic empowerment. Furthermore, we must examine the double divorce trap. This is a uniquely American challenge. In many Muslim-majority countries, religious and civil divorce are integrated into a single system. In the U.S., a couple might be legally divorced in the eyes of the state of Texas or New York, but still considered married in the eyes of their religious community if they haven't obtained an Islamic talaq or khula. This leads to limping marriages, where one party, usually the woman, is trapped in a state of legal limbo, unable to move on religiously while being legally single. This masterclass will break down how modern American imams and legal experts are trying to bridge this gap through the use of Islamic prenuptial agreements, which are becoming a standard requirement in many urban centers. This part of the script is about more than just numbers. It's about the underlying tension between tradition and the American dream. We see case studies where the mahr, or the mandatory gift from the groom to the bride, is being litigated in U.S. civil courts as a prenuptial contract. This is a revolutionary shift. It means that the religious components of the marriage are being validated and scrutinized by American judges, creating a new body of Muslim American case law. We are watching the birth of a new legal and social framework in real time. The problem this solves for you today is clarity. Whether you are a member of this community, a legal professional, or a sociologist, you need to understand that the old rules no longer apply. The hush-hush era is over. The rise of social media has created divorce TikTok and support groups where experiences are shared globally, breaking the isolation that once kept these shifts hidden. We are going to explore how the digital age has made it easier to find a spouse, but also easier to find the exit door. We will analyze the data on rebound marriages, the impact on children in a community that is still learning how to co-parent across two households, and the financial implications of asset division when Islamic principles of separate property clash with American community property laws. This is the deep dive into the silent demographic revolution of the American Muslim family. By the end of this first segment, you should understand that the increase in divorce rates isn't necessarily a sign of a community in decline, but rather a community in a profound state of transition, grappling with what it means to be both fully Muslim and fully American in the 21st century. We are peeling back the layers of the suburban myth to reveal the complex, lived reality of millions. Stay with us as we move into the data-driven specifics of how geography and socioeconomic status determine the longevity of a marriage in this diverse population. To understand the current state of divorce within the Muslim American community in 2026, we have to look at the map. Geography is not just a backdrop. It is a primary driver of how a marriage is sustained or dissolved. In the United States, we see a massive divergence between the established ethnic enclaves of the Rust Belt and the new professional class hubs of the Sun Belt. Historical trends indicate that in places like Dearborn, Michigan, or Paterson, New Jersey, the high density of the community often acts as a double-edged sword. On one hand, you have a massive support network. On the other, you have a community that, even in 2026, can exert significant social pressure to maintain the status quo. In these dense hubs, the potential outcomes of a marital dispute are often mediated through informal networks of elders and local religious leaders before they ever touch a civil court. However, contrast that with the burgeoning Muslim populations in cities like Austin, Texas, or Charlotte, North Carolina. Here, the demographic is younger, more mobile, and often physically distanced from their extended families. Imagine a couple like Michael and Sarah living in a high-rise in downtown Atlanta in 2026. Michael is a convert who works in renewable energy, and Sarah is a third-generation American Muslim working in pediatric medicine. They are part of a growing demographic that prioritizes professional mobility over geographical roots. When a marriage like theirs hits a breaking point, they don't have an uncle down the street to intervene. They don't have a neighborhood elder who has known their families for 40 years. Instead, they turn to Google, professional therapists, and secular legal systems. The lack of traditional social architecture in these new growth hubs has led to a measurable increase in the speed at which a separation moves from an idea to a legal filing. Socioeconomic status adds another layer of complexity to these demographic shifts. We are currently witnessing a phenomenon in 2026 that sociologists call the professional class paradox. In many broader American demographics, higher income and education levels are typically associated with lower divorce rates. Yet, within the American Muslim community, we are seeing a fascinating counter-trend. Among high-earning households where both spouses are professionals, doctors, engineers, or tech executives, the divorce rate is actually climbing. Case studies from the Northern Virginia and Silicon Valley corridors suggest that financial independence provides an exit ramp that simply didn't exist for previous generations. Take the case of a household in 2026 San Jose earning a combined $400,000 a year. Historically, the economic dependency of a spouse served as a structural barrier to divorce. But today, when both parties have high individual earning potential and established retirement accounts, the financial risk of a split is mitigated. They are not staying together for survival. They are staying together for fulfillment. If that fulfillment is absent, the economic cost of a divorce is seen as a manageable price for personal peace. This is a radical departure from the 1990s, where the fear of financial ruin often kept dysfunctional marriages intact. The year 2026 has also brought the rise of what we call the silver divorce within the immigrant Muslim demographic. These are couples who have been married for 30 or 40 years, who work together to build businesses and raise children in a foreign land. Once the children leave the nest and move to different states for their own careers, the primary glue of the marriage, the shared project of child-rearing, dissolves. We are seeing a spike in filings among those aged 60 and older in affluent suburbs of Orange County and Long Island. These individuals are looking at the next 20 years of their lives and deciding that they no longer want to compromise on their personal happiness, especially now that the cultural stigma that once governed their lives has been diluted by the more individualistic American culture surrounding them. Furthermore, we must analyze the specific legal geography of the United States. In 2026, different states handle the intersection of Islamic contracts and civil law in vastly different ways. This creates a geographical lottery for those going through a divorce. For example, case studies in New Jersey have shown a higher frequency of courts recognizing the mahr, or Islamic dowry, as a valid and enforceable contract under civil law. Meanwhile, in other states, the same contract might be dismissed as a religious document with no standing in a secular courtroom. This creates a strategic element to where couples choose to file for divorce. In a high-stakes divorce in 2026 involving significant assets, the choice between filing in one jurisdiction versus another can result in a difference of hundreds of thousands of dollars in the final settlement. Step by step, the process for a modern American Muslim divorce has become a multi-track marathon. First, there is the civil filing, which handles the division of assets, child custody, and alimony according to state law. Then, there is the religious track, where the couple must navigate their local mosque or a national council to obtain a religious dissolution. In 2026, we are seeing the emergence of professional mediation centers that specialize in aligning these two tracks. These centers employ both JD-holding lawyers and scholars trained in Islamic jurisprudence. The goal is to avoid the limping marriage scenario, where a woman is legally divorced in the eyes of the state of Illinois, but still religiously married, because her husband refuses to grant a religious divorce. These mediation centers are becoming the new standard for the upper-middle-class demographic, providing a streamlined, albeit expensive, path to total closure. The data also points toward an interesting trend in the Rust Belt specifically. While we see a move toward professionalization in the Sun Belt, the established communities in places like Michigan are experiencing a resurgence of community-based arbitration. In 2026, younger activists in these communities are pushing for more transparent and equitable religious councils to handle domestic disputes. They are moving away from the old-school model of a single imam making a decision behind closed doors and toward a committee-based approach that includes female scholars and mental health professionals. This demographic is attempting to modernize the tradition from within, rather than bypassing it for the secular courts. When you combine these factors, the geographical shift to the Sun Belt, the rise of the double professional household, and the emergence of silver divorces, you see a community that is no longer a monolith. A divorce in a rural mosque in Idaho looks nothing like a divorce in a megacenter in Houston. The socioeconomic divide is creating two different versions of the American Muslim experience. One is rooted in tradition and communal pressure, and the other is defined by professional autonomy and legal precision. But as we peel back these layers of geography and money, we run into a much more sensitive and powerful force that is driving these shifts. It is something that affects every household, regardless of whether they live in a mansion in Great Falls or an apartment in Queens. It is a gap that is widening every year, creating a friction that no amount of money or mediation can easily fix. It is the silent engine of the modern divorce rate, and it starts long before the marriage even begins. We have to look at the massive disparity in how men and women in the community are being educated and socialized in 2026. Because while the geography tells us where the divorces are happening, the education gap tells us why. What happens when the demographic of women outpaces the demographic of men in every measurable metric of professional and social success? That is the structural tension we are going to break down in the next part. To understand the root causes of marital dissolution in the American Muslim community in 2026, we must address the educational and professional chasm that has widened over the last decade. Historical trends have consistently shown that Muslim women in the United States are among the most highly educated and professionalized female cohorts in the nation. By 2026, this trend has reached a tipping point. We are now seeing a generation of women who have not only completed graduate degrees, but have climbed into senior leadership roles across tech, medicine, and corporate law. Meanwhile, a significant portion of the male demographic has not followed the same trajectory, leading to a profound credential and income gap that creates structural instability within the marriage. Imagine a scenario in 2026 featuring Sarah and Bilal, a couple living in the suburbs of Northern Virginia. Sarah is a 32-year-old cybersecurity analyst for a major firm, earning a six-figure salary and managing a team of 20. Bilal is a 34-year-old who works in a fluctuating gig economy role and maintains a worldview rooted in the traditional provider-protector model he saw in his parents' home in the early 2000s. On paper, they share the same faith and ethnic background, but their daily realities are worlds apart. Sarah spends her day making high-stakes decisions and navigating a corporate hierarchy where her competence is her primary currency. When she returns home, she is expected to transition into a submissive role that no longer aligns with her psychological or financial reality. The potential outcomes of this mismatch are often predictable but devastating. The friction begins with the division of household labor and financial responsibility. In a traditional setting, the husband's role as the sole breadwinner granted him a certain level of executive authority in the household. In 2026, when Sarah is the one paying 70% of the mortgage and the private school tuition for their children, the traditional power dynamic collapses. If Bilal insists on maintaining total decision-making authority without the financial or emotional contribution to back it up, resentment begins to fester. This is not just a personal disagreement. It is a demographic conflict between an ancient social contract and a modern economic reality. Case studies from 2025 and 2026 show that this resentment often follows a specific step-by-step progression toward divorce. It begins with the negotiation of time. A high-earning professional like Sarah has limited cognitive bandwidth after a 10-hour workday. When the domestic burden, cooking, cleaning, and administrative management of the family falls entirely on her despite her financial contribution, she experiences what sociologists call relational burnout. The first step is the verbalized request for help. When that request is met with a defense of traditional roles, the idea that the house is a woman's domain regardless of her outside career, the marriage enters the second step, emotional withdrawal. By the third step, the couple stops arguing about chores and begins to argue about respect. Sarah feels that Bilal does not respect her time or her professional achievements. Bilal feels that Sarah's success has made her arrogant or dismissive of his masculine role. In the fourth step, the financial disparity becomes a weapon. In the heat of an argument, the reality of who is keeping the household afloat is brought to the surface. Once the financial safety net provided by the wife is used as a point of contention, the traditional bond is often irreparably broken. In 2026, Sarah does not fear the financial consequences of leaving. She fears the emotional consequences of staying in a partnership that drains her. This brings us to the concept of the success tax that many American Muslim women face. There is a documented trend where successful women feel they must shrink themselves or overperform domesticity to soothe the ego of a partner who feels economically emasculated. In previous generations, a woman might have tolerated this for the sake of the children or community standing. However, the demographic shift in 2026 shows that the second and third generations are less willing to pay this tax. They see divorce not as a failure of their faith, but as a rational response to an inequitable contract. We also have to look at the marriage market mismatch. In 2026, there are simply more professional, high-earning Muslim women than there are men who are comfortable being in a marriage with a woman who out-earns them. This creates a bottleneck. Women are staying single longer, And when they do marry, they often enter into these partnerships with a high level of scrutiny. If the marriage does not provide a net benefit to their quality of life, they are statistically more likely to initiate a khula, or a woman-led divorce. Furthermore, the social structure of 2026 has provided Sarah with the support network that Bilal does not have. Sarah has a circle of professional Muslim women who have navigated similar challenges. They offer her a roadmap for life after divorce, normalizing the experience and reducing the terror of the unknown. Bilal, conversely, often remains isolated, clinging to a version of masculinity that is increasingly at odds with the world around him. This lack of emotional agility in the male demographic is a primary driver of the spike in divorce filings we are seeing in urban centers like Dallas, Chicago, and Houston. Another critical factor in this deep dive is the role of the marriage contract itself. In 2026, more couples are utilizing the right to include stipulations in their nikah contract that explicitly outline career autonomy and domestic expectations. When these stipulations are ignored, it provides the legal and moral grounds for dissolution. We are seeing a move toward a more transactional understanding of the marriage contract, where both parties are held to a standard of performance that mirrors a professional agreement. If the provider does not provide, or if the partnership is not a partnership, the contract is viewed as breached. This educational and professional gap is not just about money, it is about a shift in values. The highly educated demographic tends to value communication, therapy, and emotional intelligence. The demographic that has not engaged with higher education to the same degree often views these things as unnecessary Western impositions. This ideological divide is the silent killer of thousands of marriages in the United States today. It creates a situation where two people are speaking entirely different languages while living under the same roof. But even as we look at these internal struggles between husbands and wives, there is an outside force that is amplifying every single one of these tensions. It is a force that follows you into your bedroom, onto your dinner table, and into your most private thoughts. In 2026, the community is no longer just being influenced by the local imam or the extended family. They are being influenced by a digital ecosystem that creates impossible standards and offers endless alternatives. The rise of the pious influencer and the curated Muslim lifestyle has created a new kind of pressure that is pushing the divorce rate even higher. We have to look at how the screen in your pocket has become the third party in every American Muslim marriage, and why the digital age is making it harder than ever to stay committed. That is the psychological and technological shift we will explore in the next part. The concept of a third party in a marriage historically referred to an intrusive relative or a physical affair. But in 2026, the primary intruder is the glass and silicon device in your palm. To understand the current demographic shifts in Muslim American divorce, we have to analyze the technological architecture of the modern relationship. Historical trends show that digital integration has moved from a convenience to a primary determinant of marital stability. We are seeing a specific phenomenon in 2026 that sociologists call the digital erosion of the domestic sphere. This isn't just about spending too much time on your phone. It is about the fundamental displacement of emotional intimacy by a curated, virtual reality. Imagine a case study from 2026 involving Omar and Layla, a couple in their late 20s living in the tech-heavy suburbs of Seattle. Omar is a software engineer and Layla is a digital marketing consultant. Their day-to-day interactions are heavily mediated by their devices. They might sit across from each other at dinner in a high-end restaurant, but their attention is fragmented. Omar is checking professional updates, and Layla is scrolling through a feed of perfectly curated Muslim lifestyles. This is what researchers call phubbing or phone snubbing, and in 2026, it has become a leading indicator of marital dissatisfaction. When one partner consistently prioritizes the digital world over the person sitting right in front of them, it creates a psychological state of neglect that is just as damaging as physical absence. The potential outcomes of phubbing are a slow but steady breakdown of the feedback loop that sustains a marriage. Step by step, the couple loses the ability to read each other's micro-expressions. They stop having the unplanned, spontaneous conversations that build deep emotional reserves. In 2026, this creates a vacuum that is quickly filled by the comparison trap. Layla sees images of pious influencers, couples who appear to have achieved the perfect balance of religious devotion, professional success, and aesthetic beauty. These influencers often post highly staged photos of lavish vacations, elaborate Eid celebrations, and constant displays of public affection. For a viewer like Layla, who is experiencing the mundane stresses of a real-life marriage, these images create a distorted baseline. She begins to view her own marriage as inadequate, not because it is failing, but because it doesn't match the filtered reality on her screen. This brings us to the paradox of choice, a psychological shift accelerated by the explosion of Muslim-focused matrimonial apps like Muzmatch and Salams. In the early 2010s, these platforms were seen as a revolutionary way for Muslims to find compatible partners outside their immediate social circles. By 2026, the sheer volume of choices has created a consumerist mindset regarding marriage. Historically, the difficulty of finding a suitable partner acted as a stabilizer for existing marriages. You worked through problems because the alternative was a return to an empty dating market. Today, the screen offers the illusion of an endless supply of better options. Consider the psychological impact on a husband like Omar. If he faces conflict at home, the matrimonial apps he once used to find Layla are still just a few taps away. Even if he doesn't actively use them, the knowledge that there are thousands of other potential partners, categorized by education, ethnicity, and levels of religiosity, creates a subconscious exit strategy. This leads to a decreased willingness to engage in the difficult work of marital counseling or compromise. Case studies in 2026 show that the higher the number of matches an individual had prior to marriage, the lower their threshold for conflict within the marriage. They are haunted by the idea that they might have made a suboptimal choice. Furthermore, we must address the rise of digital infidelity and micro-cheating in the 2026 landscape. In the context of Islamic jurisprudence, the concepts of nuziyas or disobedience and shikak or chronic dispute are being redefined by the digital age. Digital infidelity doesn't always involve a physical meeting. It starts with the direct message culture. It might be as simple like on a photo, a brief exchange of comments, or a conversation with an old acquaintance that crosses the boundary of marital privacy. Because these interactions are digital and often hidden, they create a secret world that excludes the spouse. In the American Muslim community, where privacy and modesty are high values, the discovery of a secret digital life is often seen as a total breach of trust that is impossible to repair. The year 2026 has also seen a demographic shift in how the divorce process itself is facilitated by technology. Historically, the logistics of divorce, finding a lawyer, understanding religious requirements, seeking support, were significant barriers. Now there are online platforms that offer a one-stop shop for the dissolution of a Muslim marriage. These sites provide secular legal forms alongside religious guidance on how to execute a proper talaq or khula. You can now download a customized Islamic divorce kit that is compliant with the laws of states like California or New York. This lowered barrier to entry means that a couple can move from an argument to a legal filing in a matter of days. The friction that once allowed for a cooling-off period has been removed by the efficiency of the digital economy. Let's look at the data on technofrance. A 2026 survey of American Muslim couples found that over 60% cited phone use as a major source of conflict. The problem is that the digital world never sleeps. In a traditional 20th century home, the front door was a boundary. When you came home, you were present. In 2026, the workplace, the social circle, and the global news cycle follow you into the most intimate spaces. For many couples, the bedroom has become a place where they sit side by side in silence, each absorbed in a different digital universe. This lack of shared reality makes it nearly impossible to resolve the deep-seated demographic tensions we discussed earlier, such as the gender education gap or financial disputes. The digital age has also changed the role of the community in preventing divorce. In the past, the mosque was a physical space for mediation. In 2026, religious authority is becoming decentralized. Couples are more likely to seek advice from a YouTube scholar or a TikTok personality than their local imam. While this provides access to a wider range of opinions, it lacks the personal, localized context that traditional mediation offered. A scholar in another country might give advice based on their own cultural reality, which may not apply to the specific legal and social challenges of a couple living in the United States. This disconnect between global digital advice and local lived reality often exacerbates the conflict rather than resolving it. We see a direct correlation between social media addiction scores and the likelihood of divorce filings in major metropolitan areas. The constant dopamine loop of likes and notifications makes the slow, often unrewarding work of building a long-term partnership feel boring by comparison. The marriage becomes the background noise to a much more exciting digital life. This is the silent engine of the modern divorce rate. It is a technological shift that has outpaced our biological and social ability to adapt. We are trying to maintain a 1,000-year-old institution using tools that were designed to capture our attention, and keep us searching for the next best thing. But as devastating as these digital intruders are to the couple, the real demographic impact isn't just about the two people who decide to split. The most profound shifts are happening in the lives of those who have no choice in the matter. We are currently watching the first generation of children raised in this high-divorce, high-tech environment come of age. The way we handle custody, co-parenting, and the transmission of values in a broken home is going to define the American Muslim community for the next 50 years. How does the concept of the family survive when the household is no longer a single unit? We are moving from the breakdown of the couple to the restructuring of the entire next generation. That is the demographic ripple effect we will track in the next part. The restructuring of the household from a single nuclear unit into a dual residency reality is perhaps the most significant demographic shift occurring within the American Muslim community in 2026. Historically, the preservation of the family unit was viewed as a communal obligation that superseded individual grievances. However, as the data from the mid-2020s indicates, we are moving toward a model where the family is no longer defined by a shared roof, but by a shared commitment to the next generation. This shift creates a complex ripple effect that touches everything from child psychology to the economic distribution of generational wealth. To understand this, we have to look at the day-to-day lived experience of the children who are caught in the middle of this structural transformation. Imagine if you are looking at the life of a 10-year-old named Adam in 2026, living in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. His parents, David and Miriam, finalized their divorce 2 years ago. In the old paradigm, David might have moved back with his parents or remained a distant figure. But in 2026, David lives in a townhome only 15 minutes away. He is an active co-parent who uses digital scheduling apps to coordinate everything from soccer practice to weekend Quran classes. This is what we call the parallel household model. In this scenario, Adam is navigating two distinct environments that may have different rules, different levels of religious practice, and different cultural expectations. The demographic shift here is the rise of the high-investment divorced father. Historical trends in the U.S. Muslim community often saw mothers taking on the near-total burden of child-rearing post-divorce, but the contemporary case studies show a significant increase in fathers seeking 50-50 custody arrangements. This move toward shared physical and legal custody brings us to a massive legal friction point: the conflict between American civil law and traditional interpretations of Islamic custody. In many traditional frameworks, custody of young children, known as hadhana, is primarily granted to the mother until the children reach a certain age, at which point the father may take a more prominent role. However, U.S. civil courts in 2026 operate strictly on the best interest of the child standard. This standard does not recognize religious tradition as a binding legal precedent, unless it was explicitly stipulated in a valid prenuptial agreement. Consequently, we are seeing a spike in high-stakes litigation where parents argue over the specifics of a child's religious upbringing. For example, a case study from 2025 in Michigan involved a dispute where the mother wanted the children to attend a secular private school, while the father insisted on a full-time Islamic academy. In a civil court, the judge had to weigh the academic ranking of the schools and the children's existing social ties, rather than the religious merits of the curriculum. These potential outcomes mean that in 2026, divorce often forces a religious negotiation that never would have happened in a stable marriage. Parents are forced to define exactly what their values are, because they can no longer take for granted that their ex-spouse will reinforce those same values during their parenting time. Step by step, the transmission of religious identity is being decentralized. When a child moves between two homes, the consistency of religious practice can be disrupted. If Miriam's household is strictly halal observant but David's household is more relaxed, the child, Adam, is forced to become a religious negotiator at a very young age. He learns to code switch. He learns that faith is not a monolith but something that is practiced with varying degrees of intensity. This is creating a new demographic of American Muslim youth, who are highly critical and analytical of their own traditions. They are less likely to accept a value just because it was told to them and more likely to examine how that value is lived out in practice. Furthermore, we must address the rise of the blended family as a standard demographic reality. In 2026, the stigma against marrying a divorced person has significantly eroded, particularly among the second and third generations. This has led to an explosion of households that include step-parents, step-siblings, and half-siblings. Imagine the complexity of a holiday or an Eid celebration in this environment. You might have 4 or 5 different adult figures all playing a role in a child's life. While this can provide a wider net of emotional support, It also introduces new psychological stressors. Case studies on blended Muslim families show that the role of the step-parent is often one of the most contested spaces. There is frequently a tension between the biological parent's authority and the step-parent's daily involvement, especially when it comes to discipline and religious instruction. The economic impact on the next generation is another deep dive topic we cannot ignore. In a single household family, resources are pooled. Generational wealth is built through the equity of a single home and the consolidation of savings. When that household splits, the cost of living doubles. 2 mortgages, 2 sets of utility bills, and the legal fees associated with the divorce itself can drain college funds and inheritance prospects. In 2026, we are seeing a trend where the children of divorced Muslim parents may have less financial support for higher education than their peers from intact families, simply due to the fragmentation of the family's economic base. This creates a secondary demographic shift, where the upward mobility of the community could be slowed down by the sheer cost of marital dissolution. The role of the grandparents also undergoes a radical transformation in this 2026 landscape. Historically, grandparents were the anchors of tradition. In a divorce scenario, they often become the primary emotional refuge for the children. However, they can also become agents of conflict if they carry the cultural stigmas of the past. We see many cases where paternal grandparents feel a sense of loss regarding their lineage or access to their grandchildren, leading to further legal battles over grandparent visitation rights. In states like New York and California, the law is increasingly recognizing the importance of these extended family bonds, but the emotional cost of navigating these relationships post-divorce is staggering. What we are witnessing is the birth of the decentralized Muslim family. The identity of the child is no longer anchored in a single home, but in a network of relationships. This requires the children to develop a high level of emotional intelligence and adaptability. They are the ones who have to remember which house has which rules and which parent is sensitive about which topics. This psychological load is a silent factor that will define the leadership of the community in the next 30 years. These children are growing up with a first-hand understanding of conflict resolution, legal systems, and the complexity of human relationships. But there is a specific question that arises when we look at these children as they grow into young adults. As they watch their parents navigate the aftermath of a split, how does it change their own view of the matrimonial contract? Are we raising a generation that is more cautious about marriage, or a generation that views it as an inherently temporary arrangement? The data suggests that the way these children observe their parents' post-divorce behavior is the single greatest predictor of their own future relationship success. If the co-parenting is collaborative, the children often grow up with a healthy, albeit realistic, view of partnership. If the co-parenting is high conflict, we see a trend of relationship avoidance or early onset marital cynicism. This leads us to a much larger societal question. If the family unit is the building block of the community, and that unit is being structurally redesigned, what happens to the community's institutions? What happens to the mosque, the community center, and the school when their primary constituents are no longer nuclear families? The infrastructure of American Islam was built for the 1990s family. In 2026, those institutions are scrambling to adapt to the reality of the dual household demographic. We have to look at how the physical spaces we inhabit are being forced to change to accommodate this new reality. Because the shift isn't just happening in the home. It's happening in the pews, the classrooms, and the boardrooms of the community. In the next part, we are going to look at the institutional crisis and the rise of the divorce-friendly mosque. What does it look like when the center of communal life stops ignoring the reality of divorce and starts building around it? We will explore the radical new programs and structural changes being implemented to keep the community from fracturing along with the families. The institutional landscape of American Islam in 2026 is undergoing a forced metamorphosis. For decades, the mosque was the sanctuary of the intact family, a place where the social fabric was woven together by the presence of both parents and their children in the front rows. But as the demographic data reveals a community where nearly 1/3 of marriages are navigating some form of legal or religious dissolution, the mosque can no longer afford to be a museum of the perfect past. It must become a hospital for the present. We are seeing the rise of the divorce-friendly mosque, an institutional shift that is as much about economic survival as it is about spiritual care. If you walk into a leading community center in a hub like Orange County or North Dallas today, you will see the physical manifestations of this change. Historical trends suggest that mosques were once built with a focus on the prayer hall and the school. In 2026, the blueprints are changing. New constructions often include a dedicated social services wing that is physically separated from the main administrative offices to provide a level of privacy for those seeking counseling. This is the first step in the institutional destigmatization of divorce. By creating a space where a recently separated individual can enter without being funneled through the main lobby, the institution is acknowledging the vulnerability of this demographic. Imagine if you were looking at the life of a man named Marcus in suburban Chicago. Marcus is a 40-year-old father of 3 who recently went through a high-conflict divorce. In the historical model of the early 2000s, Marcus might have stopped attending the mosque altogether out of a sense of shame, or because he felt the sermons were exclusively tailored to traditional family units. In 2026, however, he finds a community that has pivoted. The Friday sermons in these progressive centers have moved away from abstract theological debates and toward the gritty reality of co-parenting, managing anger, and the ethics of asset division. This shift in rhetoric is the second step, the normalization of the struggle. When the leadership speaks openly about the potential outcomes of a broken home, the stigma loses its oxygen. Radical new programs are the third step in this evolution. We are seeing the implementation of what some call the reintegration initiative. This involves peer-to-peer support groups that are led by licensed mental health professionals who also share the faith of the participants. These are not just casual meetups. They are structured 12-week programs that cover the psychological stages of divorce, from initial shock to the rebuilding of a solo identity. Case studies from centers in Houston and Northern Virginia show that these groups are the primary reason why divorced individuals remain connected to the community. They provide a safe harbor where people can talk about the double divorce trap and the legal complexities of their civil filings without feeling like they are being judged as religious failures. But the most controversial and perhaps most effective shift is the rise of the halal divorcee mixer. In 2026, institutional leaders have realized that the fastest way to stabilize a community is to facilitate healthy remarriage. Historically, a divorced woman, especially one with children, was often viewed as having less social capital in the marriage market. The mosque is now intervening to disrupt this narrative. They are hosting structured networking events specifically for those who have been previously married. These events focus on compatibility, shared experiences, and transparency regarding past relationships. By taking an active role in remarriage, the mosque is signaling that a divorce is a chapter, not the whole book. The role of the imam is also being fundamentally professionalized in 2026. The days of the volunteer imam, who handles everything from roof repairs to marital mediation, are fading. Modern American mosques are increasingly hiring associate imams who specialize in family law and social work. This professionalization involves a strict set of boundaries. Step by step, the mediation process has been codified. There is now a clear intake process, a requirement for both parties to sign a mediation agreement, and a commitment to transparency. In many cases, the mosque will refuse to offer religious mediation unless the couple is also working with a licensed secular therapist. This integration of faith and science is a hallmark of the 2026 demographic shift. It acknowledges that spiritual advice alone is often insufficient to handle the complexities of modern psychological trauma. This brings us to the financial impact on these institutions. A mosque is a nonprofit entity that relies on the contributions of its members. When a high-earning couple divorces, their giving patterns change. They might split their donations, or one party might stop giving altogether as they redirect funds toward legal fees and separate households. To mitigate this, mosques are diversifying their funding models. They are moving away from the large donor model and toward a broader base of smaller, recurring donations from a wider variety of demographics, including singles and divorced professionals. This economic reality is forcing the boards of these institutions to listen to the needs of the non-traditional family. If you ignore 30% of your potential donor base, your institution will eventually fail. We also see the emergence of legal clinics hosted within the mosque. In 2026, it is common to see a Saturday workshop where Muslim lawyers provide pro bono or low-cost advice on how to navigate the civil court system while maintaining religious integrity. These clinics teach participants how to draft a divorce decree that accounts for religious holidays, how to handle the division of the mahr in a way that satisfies both state law and personal conscience, and how to protect children from the fallout of the litigation. This is a form of legal literacy that is empowering a generation of women and men to exit toxic situations with their dignity and their finances intact. The 2026 model of the American mosque is one that accepts the reality of human frailty. It is a space that understands that the community is not just a collection of perfect households, but a mosaic of different life stages. By building programs that support the divorced, the mosque is actually strengthening the institution of marriage in the long run. They are creating a culture where people are not afraid to seek help early, and where those who do separate are not lost to the faith. However, as the institution changes to accommodate the family's collapse, a new and perhaps more dangerous trend is emerging in the private lives of the individuals involved. While the mosque is becoming more supportive, the individual's internal world is becoming a battleground of a different kind. There is a psychological phenomenon that is sweeping through the community, one that researchers are just beginning to name. It is a specific type of identity crisis that happens when a person realizes that they have spent their entire life performing a role that no longer exists. They are no longer a spouse, perhaps only a part-time parent, and their social circle has been halved. This is the moment where the risk of total disillusionment is at its highest. We have to look at the silent epidemic of the 2026 identity rebrand. How do you find out who you are when the person you thought you were has been legally and socially erased? That is the psychological deep dive we will take in the next part. The psychological aftermath of a 2026 divorce within the American Muslim community is rarely just about the end of a romantic partnership. It is a total structural collapse of an identity that was often built on the foundations of communal performance. To understand this deep-seated shift, we have to look at what sociologists are now calling the 2026 identity rebrand. Historical trends show that for decades, the social currency of an individual within the mosque and the broader ethnic community was intrinsically tied to their status as a married person. In 2026, when that status is revoked, the individual doesn't just lose a spouse, they lose their seat at the table of social relevance. This creates a psychological vacuum that forces a radical and often painful reconstruction of the self. Imagine if you were looking at the life of a woman named Jessica in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. Jessica is 38, a high-achieving pediatric surgeon, and until recently, she was one half of a power couple in her local community. Her marriage was a central pillar of her public persona. She was the one organizing the annual community fundraisers. She was the one whose children were held up as the gold standard of Islamic upbringing. When her marriage dissolved in the spring of 2026, Jessica didn't just face the logistical nightmare of moving houses. She faced a demographic phenomenon known as social ghosting. In many tight-knit American Muslim circles, social life is organized around couples. Dinner parties, weekend trips, and even WhatsApp groups are designed for pairs. When Jessica became single, she inadvertently became a source of social friction. She was no longer a natural fit for the couple-centric activities, and her presence reminded her peers of the fragility of their own unions. This social death leads to the first major step of the identity rebrand, the audit of the performing self. In 2026, many individuals are realizing that they spent years performing a version of themselves that was curated for the community's gaze. Case studies of divorced women in their late 30s show a common thread of reclaiming suppressed interests. Jessica's audit involved a realization that her hobbies, her style of dress, and even her professional ambitions had been subtly modulated to fit the expectations of a traditional wife. The potential outcomes of this audit are profound. We are seeing a demographic shift where divorced women are pivoting into new career paths, pursuing higher levels of artistic expression, or even changing their religious practice to find a more personal, less performative connection to the divine. This is the search for an Islam that exists outside the matrimonial contract. But the psychological shift isn't limited to women. Consider a case study involving a man named James in Seattle. James is a 45-year-old convert who entered the faith 15 years ago, when he married into a large, established immigrant family. For James, his entire Islamic identity was mediated through his wife and her relatives. They were his bridge to the language, the food, and the communal rituals. When the marriage ended in 2026, James found himself in a spiritual wilderness. He didn't just lose a wife, he lost his entire support system. This is what we call the convert crisis of divorce. Historical trends suggest that converts are at a significantly higher risk of leaving the faith entirely following a divorce because their social integration was never independent of their spouse. James's journey in 2026 represents the second major step of the rebrand, the search for a solo spiritual anchor. Step by step, James had to navigate the mosque as a single man without a family to vouch for him. He had to decide if his commitment to the faith was based on a personal conviction or a social convenience. This demographic of single, often isolated, men is growing in urban centers. They are the ones seeking out new non-traditional spaces, like online convert support groups or specialized men's mental health circles, that offer a sense of belonging that isn't dependent on marital status. The 2026 identity rebrand for men like James often involves moving away from the cultural baggage of their former in-laws and toward a more universal, American-centric interpretation of the faith. The digital landscape of 2026 also plays a massive role in this psychological reconstruction. We are witnessing the rise of the curated divorce narrative. Historically, a divorce was something you hid. Today, it is something you frame. People like Jessica use social media to signal their new identity. This isn't just about vanity. It is about social survival. By posting about her solo travels, her fitness journey, or her professional awards, Jessica is signaling to the community that she is still a person of high value. She is attempting to control the narrative of her life before the community's rumor mill can define her as a failure. This digital rebranding is a defense mechanism against the traditional shame culture that still lingers in the older demographic. However, the internal reality is often much grimmer than the digital feed suggests. In 2026, the psychological toll of this transition is manifesting in a spike of anxiety and depression among newly divorced American Muslims. The pressure to rebrand and stay relevant, while simultaneously grieving the loss of a life partner, creates a state of chronic stress. Many individuals describe a feeling of being a stranger in their own skin. They have spent so long being wife of or husband of that they have forgotten how to be just themselves. The third step in the identity rebrand is the reconstruction of the social circle. In 2026, this often involves the great friend audit. Divorced individuals find that some friendships were merely situational. They lose the friends they shared with their spouse and gain a new circle of fellow travelers, other divorced people who understand the unique stigma they face. This demographic shift is creating subcommunities within the community. We now have distinct social layers: the intact families, the young singles, and the second-timers. The second-timers are a demographic that is increasingly influential. They are more skeptical, more resilient, and less likely to tolerate toxic communal norms. They are the ones pushing for the institutional changes we discussed earlier, like divorce-friendly mosques and transparent mediation. The potential outcomes of this widespread identity rebranding are changing the very nature of American Muslim leadership. We are seeing a new wave of community leaders, scholars, and influencers who are themselves divorced. They speak from a place of lived experience rather than abstract theory. They are normalizing the idea that a life can be broken and then rebuilt into something even more beautiful and authentic. This is the ultimate goal of the 2026 identity rebrand: the move from being a victim of a demographic trend to being an architect of a new way of living. But as these individuals find their new footing and reclaim their identities, they eventually hit a wall that no amount of psychological rebranding can scale. It is the cold, hard reality of the U.S. legal and financial system. You can rebuild your soul, but you still have to divide the bank accounts. You can find your new voice, but you still have to fight for your fair share of the assets in a system that doesn't always understand the nuances of your religious contracts. We've looked at the heart and the mind, but now we have to look at the wallet. The most explosive part of the divorce shift in 2026 isn't the emotional fallout. It's the financial war. We are going to dive into the high-stakes world of the Mar battles in civil court, the hidden costs of separate property, and why your marriage contract might be your biggest financial liability. That is the economic deep dive we are taking in the next part. The financial architecture of a divorce in the American Muslim community in 2026 has become a high-stakes arena where ancient contractual obligations meet the rigid precision of United States civil law. When the emotional and psychological ties of a marriage are severed, the remaining battlefield is almost always built on a foundation of dollars and cents. To understand the current demographic shift, we have to look at how the wallet has become the primary site of conflict. Divorce is effectively the most expensive financial transaction the average person will ever participate in, and for the Muslim American demographic, the complexity is doubled by the existence of the Mar, or the Islamic dowry. Historical trends show that for decades, the Mar was often treated as a symbolic gesture, a number written on a mosque certificate that few expected to be litigated in a secular court. However, in 2026, the potential outcomes of a divorce filing often hinge on whether a state judge views that religious document as a legally binding prenuptial agreement. This has led to the rise of what legal scholars call the Mar Wars. Case studies from jurisdictions like New Jersey, Michigan, and California show a massive increase in civil litigation surrounding these payments. Imagine a case study from 2026 involving a couple named Sophia and Daniel in Alexandria, Virginia. When they married in 2018, their nikah contract specified a postponed mahr of $75,000. At the time, Daniel viewed it as a traditional formality. Sophia, however, saw it as her financial safety net. As they enter the divorce process in 2026, Daniel's legal team argues that the mahr is a religious gift, and that enforcing it would violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which prevents courts from entangling themselves in religious doctrine. Sophia's team counters using the doctrine of neutral principles of law. They argue that the mahr is a simple contract. There was an offer, an acceptance, and a consideration. They contend that the court can enforce the payment without ever needing to interpret Islamic theology. The step-by-step reality of this litigation is exhausting. First, the court must determine if the document meets the state's requirements for a prenuptial agreement, such as full financial disclosure and the absence of coercion. In 2026, many of these religious contracts are failing this test because they were signed minutes before the wedding ceremony without independent legal counsel. This creates a demographic of women who believed they were financially protected, but find themselves legally vulnerable. Conversely, if the court does enforce the mahr, it can lead to a situation where the husband is ordered to pay the $75,000 in addition to the equitable distribution of marital assets. This is the financial double jeopardy that is driving a surge in the use of secular prenuptial agreements within the community. Beyond the mahr, we must address the fundamental clash between Islamic property rights and U.S. state laws. Under Islamic jurisprudence, there is no concept of community property. What a woman earns is hers, and what a man earns is his, provided he fulfills his obligation to maintain the household. In 2026, this creates a profound disconnect for high-earning couples in states like Texas or Washington. Imagine a scenario where Sophia is a high-level executive at a tech firm. Over 8 years of marriage, she has saved $300,000 in her individual accounts, adhering to the religious principle that her income is her separate property. However, under the civil laws of a community property state, every dollar earned during the marriage is owned 50-50. When the divorce is filed in 2026, Sophia is shocked to find that the secular court views her separate savings as a marital asset. This leads to a sense of religious injustice. She feels the law is stripping her of her rights, while Daniel may feel that the secular law is the only thing ensuring he isn't left destitute after supporting her career growth. This economic friction is a primary driver of the bitterness seen in 2026 divorce proceedings. It forces couples to choose between their religious understanding of ownership and the legal reality of their residency. We must also look at the hidden costs of separate property and lifestyle inflation. In 2026, the American Muslim middle class has embraced a high-consumption lifestyle. Large homes in affluent suburbs, private school tuitions, and frequent international travel have created a high monthly burn rate. When a household splits, that lifestyle becomes unsustainable. The data shows that the standard of living for divorced Muslim women in the U.S. often drops significantly more than that of their former husbands, especially if they have been out of the workforce. Step by step, the division of the primary residence becomes the most contentious point. In 2026, with interest rates and housing prices in a state of flux, many couples find that neither can afford to buy the other out. They are forced to sell the family home, which disrupts the children's stability and the family's social standing in the community. Furthermore, forensic accounting has become a standard tool in 2026 Muslim American divorces. We are seeing a demographic shift where one spouse may attempt to shield assets by sending money overseas to relatives in their country of origin, under the guise of zakat or family support. In a 2026 courtroom, these transfers are scrutinized heavily. If a judge determines that funds were transferred to avoid distribution, they can issue a waste claim, where the value of those transferred funds is credited back to the other spouse's side of the ledger. This level of financial scrutiny is a new reality for a community that historically handled financial matters with a high degree of privacy and trust. The cost of the divorce itself is also a demographic factor. In 2026, a contested divorce involving both civil lawyers and religious mediators can easily exceed $100,000 in total fees. This is wealth that is effectively deleted from the family's future. For the children of these families, the potential outcomes are a reduction in their inheritance and a lack of funding for higher education. We are watching the erosion of generational wealth in real time, as the assets built by the immigrant generation are liquidated to pay for the legal battles of the second generation. Finally, we have to consider the tax implications. In 2026, the transfer of assets as part of an Islamic settlement must be carefully structured to avoid triggering massive capital gains taxes. If a husband transfers a portion of his business to his wife to satisfy a mahr obligation, and it isn't documented as part of a court-ordered divorce decree, the IRS may view it as a taxable event. This technical complexity is why we are seeing the rise of a new professional class, the Muslim divorce financial analyst. These are professionals who specialize in the intersection of Islamic finance, U.S. tax code, and matrimonial law. The economic war of 2026 is a reflection of a community that has fully integrated into the American economic machine, but is still trying to hold onto a religious legal framework. The friction between these two systems is where the most pain is felt. It is no longer enough to have a religious contract. In 2026, you need a legal strategy. The wallet has become the final arbiter of the marriage's end. But as the bank accounts are drained and the assets are divided, a new question emerges. Once the financial dust settles, where do these individuals go? The demographic shift doesn't end with the legal decree. It moves into the social marketplace. In 2026, there is a massive, growing population of divorced Muslims who are looking for a second chance. They are entering a remarriage market that is fundamentally different from the one they navigated in their 20s. The rules have changed, the stakes are higher, and the digital tools are more aggressive. We have to look at the second-timers demographic and the brutal reality of the 2026 remarriage market. How do you find love again when you are carrying the financial and emotional scars of a 10-part deep dive into dissolution? That is the social and romantic reconstruction we are exploring in the next part. The social marketplace of 2026 for the divorced Muslim American is not the desolate landscape of shame that it was in the late 1990s. Instead, it has transformed into a high-stakes, data-driven environment of cautious reconstruction. To understand this demographic shift, we have to look at the rise of the second-timer cohort. This group, primarily composed of individuals in their 30s and 40s, now represents nearly 40% of all new matrimonial activity in urban centers like Los Angeles, Chicago, and Northern Virginia. Historical trends indicate that while a divorce was once seen as a permanent exit from the community's social fabric, in 2026, it is increasingly viewed as a prerequisite for a more mature, refined second chapter. Imagine a case study involving a woman named Aisha in 2026 living in the suburbs of Irvine, California. Aisha is 37, a successful architectural consultant, and a mother of two. In the previous generation, Aisha's demographic profile, divorced with children, would have made her an outlier in the marriage market, often relegated to the status of a secondary choice. But in 2026, Aisha is part of the most sought-after demographic community. Why? Because the market has shifted its valuation from purity to stability and emotional intelligence. Potential outcomes for Aisha no longer involve settling for a partner she doesn't desire. She is now navigating a market where her experience is viewed as a premium. The step-by-step vetting process Aisha uses in 2026 is a masterclass in risk management. In her 20s, her vetting process was centered on shared cultural backgrounds and parental approval. Now, it begins with digital forensic transparency. Before a first meeting even occurs, there is an exchange of what we call the 2026 relationship resume. This isn't a formal document, but a social expectation of transparency regarding the reasons for the first divorce. A clear summary of current financial obligations including child support or alimony, and a statement on co-parenting dynamics. If a potential partner cannot provide a clear, accountable narrative of their past, the interaction ends before the first coffee date. This high level of scrutiny is a direct response to the demographic trauma of the previous decade. The technological shift has also caught up with this demographic. In 2026, matrimonial apps have introduced specialized second-timer tiers. These features allow Aisha to filter for partners who specifically have children, or who have also navigated a legal dissolution. This creates a psychological safe harbor. When Aisha meets Robert, a 40-year-old software director from Houston who is also divorced, there is an immediate baseline of shared reality. They don't have to explain the complexity of a weekend custody swap or the emotional fatigue of a mediation session. They speak the same legal and emotional language. However, the 2026 remarriage market introduces a new kind of third party, the digital ghost of the ex-spouse. Imagine if Aisha and Robert decide to move toward a marriage contract. In 2026, their past is not just a memory. It is a permanent digital record. Social media background checks have become a standard vetting tool. It is common for potential partners to reach out to mutual connections on professional networks like LinkedIn to verify the character and professional standing of a candidate. In some extreme case studies, individuals have even requested to see the final divorce decree of a potential partner to verify that there are no hidden legal liabilities or ongoing litigation. This level of extreme vetting would have been seen as offensive in 2006, but in 2026 it is seen as due diligence. The financial reconstruction of the second-timer is where the demographic shift gets particularly complicated. In 2026, the Muslim American prenuptial agreement is no longer a niche legal tool. It is a mandatory requirement for the majority of professional remarriages. Aisha, having lost a significant portion of her individual savings in her first divorce, is not willing to risk her children's inheritance on a second attempt. The potential outcomes of a remarriage without a prenup are viewed as too risky. Step by step, Aisha and Robert must sit down with a matrimonial attorney to draft a document that carves out their pre-existing assets, defines how new income will be shared, and explicitly outlines how the mahr will be handled in the event of a second split. This transactional approach to love is a hallmark of the 2026 demographic. It is a marriage of the head as much as the heart. We also have to analyze the role of the child gatekeepers. In 2026, children of divorce are more digitally connected and socially aware than any previous generation. They are not passive observers of their parents' remarriage, they are active participants. Aisha's 10-year-old daughter has her own set of standards for who enters her home. If a potential partner does not pass the vibe check of the children, the relationship often fails to progress. This has created a demographic shift where the courtship is no longer between two individuals, but between two family systems. The logistics of integrating two households, managing different parenting styles, different religious observation levels, and even different dietary habits, becomes a project management challenge that rivals a corporate merger. Historical trends show that remarriages within the community are statistically more likely to succeed when both parties have undergone professional counseling. In 2026, we see a spike in pre-remarriage therapy. This isn't the traditional advice from an elder. It is a clinical intervention designed to identify triggers from the first marriage. Case studies indicate that the most successful second-timers are those who have spent at least 2 years in a recovery phase before re-entering the market. This creates a demographic of older, more self-aware newlyweds who are less likely to fall into the same traps of communication breakdown and financial secrecy that plagued their first unions. But there is a darker side to the 2026 market. For those who do not have the high earning potential of an Aisha or a Robert, the remarriage market can be incredibly punishing. The market value myth still persists in less professionalized circles, where age and the number of children are used as leverage to pressure individuals into less than ideal partnerships. We see a growing divide in 2026 between the professional second-timers, who have the leverage to demand equity, and the traditional second-timers, who are still struggling against the lingering cultural stigmas of the immigrant generation. This socioeconomic gap is creating two different versions of the American Muslim remarriage experience. Furthermore, we must look at the rise of the nikah-only second marriage. In 2026, some older couples, those in their 50s and 60s who have already raised their children, are choosing to get religiously married without filing for a civil marriage license. This is a strategic demographic shift designed to protect Social Security benefits, pension plans, and estate distributions from the first marriage. They want the companionship and the religious blessing, but they want to keep their financial lives strictly segregated. This creates a new category of living together separately that is becoming a standard feature of the American Muslim retirement landscape. The remarriage market of 2026 is a reflection of a community that has matured through pain. It is a market that prizes transparency over mystery and resilience over perfection. As Aisha and Robert navigate their path toward a second ceremony, they are not just looking for a spouse, they are looking for a co-pilot for the rest of a very complex life. They are the architects of a new kind of family unit, one that is built on the ruins of the old but reinforced with the steel of hard-won experience. But as these new families form and the demographic landscape of the community continues to shift, we have to look toward the horizon. This 10-part deep dive has shown us the raw data of the present, but what does the future hold? We are standing on the edge of a fundamental transformation of the American Muslim identity. The patterns we've seen in 2026 are not just local trends. They are the blueprint for a global shift in how faith and family intersect in the modern world. In the final part of this series, we are going to synthesize everything we've learned. We are going to look at the legacy of the split and ask the most important question of all. Is the American Muslim family breaking down? Or is it finally breaking through? Stay with us for the conclusion of the masterclass. The legacy of the split in 2026 is not merely a collection of broken contracts or divided households, but a fundamental realignment of what it means to be a Muslim in the United States. As we conclude this masterclass, we must address the central question that has haunted every mosque board and every kitchen table discussion from Michigan to Florida. Is the American Muslim family breaking down, or is it finally breaking through? To answer this, we have to look at the long-term demographic outcomes of the children who are now growing up in the parallel household models we have analyzed. We are currently watching the first generation of American Muslims who do not view divorce as a catastrophic moral failure, but as a complex, manageable, and sometimes necessary life transition. Imagine the perspective of a college student in 2026 named Sophia, the daughter of the couple we discussed in earlier segments. Sophia has grown up watching her parents navigate the high-stakes world of civil litigation and religious mediation. For her, the legacy of her parents' split is not a sense of shame, but a profound sense of legal and emotional literacy. She is part of a demographic shift where young adults are entering the marriage market with a level of skepticism and preparation that was unheard of in the 1990s. Historical trends suggest that the children of divorce in this community are becoming the primary advocates for prenuptial agreements and transparent communication. They are the ones demanding that their future nikah contracts include specific protections for career autonomy and mental health support. This is the breaking through part of the narrative. The community is moving away from a model of stability based on silence toward a model of stability based on honesty. The institutional legacy of the split in 2026 has also created a more resilient communal architecture. We have seen how mosques have evolved into social service hubs that provide more than just a place to pray. The demographic pressure of high divorce rates has forced a professionalization of religious leadership. In 2026, an imam who cannot navigate the nuances of the gender education gap or the complexities of the U.S. civil court system is increasingly viewed as obsolete. Case studies from metropolitan areas like Houston and Chicago show that mosques that have embraced a divorce-friendly posture are seeing higher retention rates among young professionals. These institutions are no longer just for the intact nuclear family, they are for the single mother, the co-parenting father, and the second-timer. This shift represents a breaking through of the monolithic cultural barriers that once isolated the most vulnerable members of the community. However, we cannot ignore the reality of the breaking down aspect. In 2026, the financial war of asset division has led to a significant erosion of generational wealth. The data indicates that the cost of high-conflict divorces has redirected millions of dollars away from education and community investment toward the legal industry. This is a structural vulnerability that the community is still struggling to address. Step by step, we are seeing the emergence of new financial literacy programs aimed specifically at preventing the total economic collapse of the household during a split. These programs focus on the potential outcomes of the Mar wars and the hidden costs of separate property, teaching couples how to de-escalate financial conflict before it reaches the courtroom. The legacy here is a community that is becoming more financially defensive, which may have long-term implications for how American Muslims build and sustain businesses and institutions. The psychological legacy is perhaps the most profound. We are witnessing the birth of a new American Muslim identity that is less performative and more authentic. The 2026 identity rebrand we discussed earlier is not just a trend. It is a permanent shift in the community's collective psyche. Individuals like Jessica and James are no longer defined by their marital status, but by their contribution to the social and intellectual life of the community. This decentralization of the marriage-centric identity has allowed for a broader range of voices to emerge in leadership positions. It has created a space for the divorced, the single, and the remarried to shape the community's future. This is the breaking through of a new social hierarchy that prizes resilience over the appearance of perfection. Step by step, the community is also developing a new jurisprudence that is uniquely American. The interactions between U.S. civil law and Islamic principles in 2026 have created a body of informal case law that provides a roadmap for future generations. This is not about changing the religion, but about adapting the application of its principles to a democratic, secular, and capitalist society. We see this in how the concepts of custody and maintenance are being renegotiated to reflect the reality of the double professional household. The potential outcomes of this legal synthesis are a more equitable and predictable system of justice for all parties involved. This is the breaking through of a mature, self-aware legal culture within the American Muslim demographic. As we look toward the next decade, the demographic shifts we have tracked indicate that the community will continue to be defined by its ability to manage conflict. The high-retention era of the 1980s and 90s, built on cultural isolation and social pressure, is gone forever. In its place is a more dynamic, albeit more fragile landscape. The American Muslim family of 2026 is a modular unit. It can be broken apart and reconstructed in different ways, but the underlying values of faith and community remain the primary glue. The resilience of the next generation depends on our ability to continue these deep-dive discussions without fear or stigma. We have moved from the era of the hidden crisis to the era of the open dialogue. The legacy of the split is a community that has looked into the mirror and decided to stop pretending. It is a community that has realized that its strength does not come from the absence of problems, but from the integrity with which it solves them. Whether this is a breaking down or a breaking through ultimately depends on the individual actions of the millions of people who make up this demographic. Every time a father chooses collaborative co-parenting over litigation, every time a mosque board funds a mental health initiative, and every time a young woman insists on a fair prenuptial contract, the community breaks through another layer of its past. This masterclass has been a journey through the raw data and the lived reality of a demographic revolution. We have explored the geography of divorce, the gender education gap, the digital intruders, the legal battlefields, and the psychological reconstructions. We have seen that the American Muslim experience in 2026 is not a static tradition, but a living, breathing evolution. The shifts we are seeing today are the labor pains of a new kind of community, one that is more inclusive, more professional, and more honest about the human condition. But even as we conclude this deep dive into the restructuring of the family, another massive shift is already gathering momentum on the horizon. The demographic changes in the household are starting to collide with a new technological and economic reality that will redefine not just how we live, but how we work and provide for the next generation. As the structure of the family changes, so too does the structure of the community's economic power. We have seen the financial war of the divorce court, but are we ready for the economic war of the next decade? The conversation about the American Muslim future is only just beginning, and the next chapter is about more than just the home. It is about the global influence of a community that has finally found its voice. In our next deep dive series, we will explore the rise of the American Muslim venture class and the high-stakes intersection of faith and the future of global finance. The revolution is moving from the living room to the boardroom, and you won't want to miss a single step of the transformation.